Today, we're diving into a story you probably haven't heard. It's about one of ancient history's most overlooked, and maybe its most devastating, military disasters. So, let me ask you a question. What do you think was Athens' single greatest military catastrophe? Now, if you're like most people, your mind probably jumped straight to that tragic invasion of Sicily, right? Well, you're not alone, but it's not the right answer. The real answer involves the loss of something like 42,500 men. And on top of that, a staggering 250 ships. Just gone, annihilated. This is the story of how an imperial dream turned into an absolute nightmare on the Nile, and it happened decades before anyone in Athens was even thinking about Sicily. Okay, so how on earth did Athens get into a mess this big? Well, like a lot of disasters, it all started with an opportunity, a prize that, honestly, seemed just too good to pass up. So, picture this. It's around 460 BC, and for Athens, it's like the stars have aligned. You've got the mighty Persian Empire, but it's looking a little shaky. There's a new king, Artaxerxes I, and he's got his hands full with internal revolts, and Egypt, one of their wealthiest provinces, is just simmering with resentment. Then you look at Athens. They are at the absolute peak of their power. Their navy, the Delian League fleet, is basically a force of nature, still riding high from a whole string of victories against Persia. It's a textbook case, right? A vulnerable giant and a confident challenger. And right into the middle of this perfect storm steps a guy named Inaros. Now, he's a Libyan king, but he's clever. His father's name was Psammetichus, and that was pure political genius. See, that name immediately brought to mind Egypt's last independent dynasty. It gave his rebellion a powerful sense of legitimacy. He manages to organize what the historian Thucydides calls a revolt of nearly the whole of Egypt, and his goal, to kick the Persians out for good. For an ambitious Athens, this looked like a golden ticket, an invitation they just couldn't turn down. So let's get into the campaign itself, because at first, oh man, it looked like one of the smartest things Athens had ever done. The Athenian fleet, we're talking 200 ships, just glides up the Nile. It was a masterclass in river warfare. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. First, you own the water. They established total naval dominance. Then, they quickly snatched up control of the entire Nile Delta. And from there, they marched straight into Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, and took over 2/3 of the city. I mean, it was a stunning, almost effortless success. Everything was going perfectly, almost perfectly. There was just one small problem. One part of the city held out, a fortress known as the White Castle. And this one little pocket of resistance, it's where the whole thing starts to unravel. You see, that siege of the White Castle, it didn't end quickly. It dragged on for years, and that gave Persia the one thing they needed: time. Time to prepare a response. And their response was brilliant, actually, a sophisticated 1-2 punch of diplomacy and brute force. Okay, first up, diplomacy. Artaxerxes sends an envoy to Sparta loaded with cash. The plan was as clever as it was cynical: bribe the Spartans, Athens' biggest rival, to invade Attica. The idea was to create a crisis back home that would force Athens to recall its army from Egypt. It just goes to show you, Persia was taking this threat very seriously. But here's the thing, Sparta said no. They refused the bribe. So with diplomacy a bust, Persia moved to Plan B. And Plan B was to send in the heavy hitters, a massive army led by one of their absolute best generals, a guy named Megabyzus, who, by the way, was part of the royal family. They weren't messing around. And this is the moment the whole thing flips. The dream of a rich Egyptian prize turns into a desperate, bloody fight for survival. So Megabyzus shows up with his army, smashes the Athenian Egyptian force, and drives them right out of Memphis. The Greeks who survive fall back to a big island in the Nile Delta called Prosopitis. It was a good defensive position, but it would become their fortress, and ultimately their prison. Think about this. For 18 months, that's a year and a half, the Athenians are stuck on this island, besieged. They're holding out, their ships still control the water around them. They're probably just hoping for reinforcements, for something to change. But Megabyzus, he had an ace up his sleeve, and it was one of the most incredible feats of military engineering you'll ever hear about. He has his army start digging. They dig massive new canals to divert the flow of the Nile itself. The channels of water surrounding the island literally just drain away. And just like that, the Athenians' greatest weapon, their ships, are useless, stuck in the mud. The Persian army didn't need boats anymore. They just walked across the new dry land. The result was an absolute slaughter. Almost the entire expeditionary force was wiped out. We're talking maybe 5% managed to escape. A handful of guys fleeing through the desert to get to the Greek city of Cyrene. Just a fraction. And if you think it couldn't get any worse, you're wrong. The tragedy wasn't over. A relief force of 50 more ships, that's another 10,000 men, was already on its way from Athens. They had no idea what had happened. They sailed straight into a Persian trap. Attacked from the land by the army and from the sea by Persia's Phoenician fleet, they were also annihilated. A double disaster of unimaginable scale. So what happens after a defeat like this? I mean, what's the fallout? The price Athens paid for this gamble would literally change the course of its history. Let's just break it down. First, the military impact. It's catastrophic. As many as 42,500 men and 250 ships. An entire generation of experienced crews just gone. Then, the political fallout. This is huge. The fear of what Persia might do next was so great that Athens moved the entire treasury of the Delian League from the island of Delos to the Acropolis in Athens. That single move is what really cemented its transformation into an Athenian empire. And finally, the strategic impact. Athens had no choice. They had to abandon their aggressive posture against Persia. And you can see the dominoes fall almost immediately. In 454 BC, the disaster is over, and they move the treasury. Just 3 years later, in 451, a much weaker Athens has to sign a truce with its rival Sparta. And 2 years after that, in 449, they finally make peace with Persia, officially ending the Greco-Persian Wars that had been going on for decades. Think about that. One failed campaign in Egypt completely reshaped the politics of the entire Greek world. And that brings us to the final, really crucial question here. An ambitious overseas campaign that promised incredible riches but ended in total annihilation. A relief force sailing completely unaware right into its own destruction. Does any of that sound familiar? Because this story sounds an awful lot like the Sicilian expedition, doesn't it? So was this Egyptian disaster just a painful lesson in imperial overreach? Or was it a warning that Athens, 40 years later, tragically failed to remember?